Just imagine, for a second, a world where you are literally the center of the universe. The Earth is perfectly still right beneath your feet, and the sun, the moon, all the stars, they're all just putting on a grand cosmic show for you. For over 1,000 years, this wasn't just a story, it was reality. And then, a man named Nicolaus Copernicus came along, and the center of everything just moved. So, the story we usually get is this big, dramatic tale. We pictured this lone scientific rebel, hunted for his radical ideas, bravely standing up to this oppressive church. A martyr for the cause of reason. But here's the thing. What if that story isn't the real story at all? Because the truth about Copernicus is so much more complicated and honestly way more interesting than the legend. Okay, let's get into it.
To really get the Copernican revolution, we first have to understand the man himself. And he was definitely not the firebrand revolutionary we all picture in our heads.
Okay, look at this. The contrast here is just wild. The myth paints him as this total outsider, persecuted for his work. But the reality? Copernicus was an insider, a respected canon in the Catholic Church. And his book, the one that supposedly got him in so much trouble, it wasn't banned right away. In fact, he dedicated it to the Pope. He wasn't some persecuted rebel, he was a quiet, incredibly studious academic. So who was this guy? Really? Born back in 1473, Copernicus was the definition of a Renaissance man. He was an administrator for the church, a medical doctor. He even wrote about economics and drew maps. Astronomy, the one we all remember him for, was actually more of a passion project than his day job. And he was doing all this with the full support of his uncle, who happened to be a very powerful bishop. And get this, some of the first and harshest criticism, it didn't even come from the Catholic Church. It came from Protestant reformers like Martin Luther. That fact alone just completely messes with that simple science versus the church story we always hear. The reality was a lot more complicated. So, what was the problem this quiet scholar was so obsessed with solving? To really appreciate his breakthrough, we have to put ourselves in his shoes and look at the universe the way they saw it back then, and try to wrap our heads around the puzzle that had astronomers stumped for centuries. For more than 1,400 years, pretty much everyone in the Western world agreed on one thing: the geocentric model. The great astronomer Ptolemy had perfected it, and the idea was simple. A motionless Earth sits right at the center of everything. And you know what? It makes sense, right? We don't feel the Earth moving. We watch the sun come up and go down every single day. It was science that was based on pure common sense. But there was this one really annoying problem. Something anyone who spent time looking at the night sky would notice. The stars, they all moved in these nice, predictable circles. But a few of those lights, the planets, they were wanderers. They'd move along, then slow down, stop, and then even seem to go backward for a while before moving forward again. It's called retrograde motion, and it was a huge puzzle. So how did the Earth-centered model explain this weird backward dance with something that was, well, both brilliant and a total mess? Epicycles. The idea was that each planet moved in a little circle, and that little circle was moving along a bigger circle around the Earth. And to get the math to actually work, they had to keep adding more circles on top of circles. It kind of worked for predicting where planets would be, but it was just so clunky. So Copernicus, being a numbers guy, he looks at this whole complicated setup and just thinks, ugh, this is a mess. It's not elegant. He was convinced there had to be a better, simpler way. And his solution, which he worked on for decades, was just beautiful in its simplicity. He basically asked, what if? What if we've got it all backward? What if the sun is the center and the Earth is just another planet going around it? And boom, suddenly that weird backward motion of the planets made perfect sense. It wasn't real, it was just an optical illusion, caused by our own planet Earth lapping a slower moving planet like Mars in its orbit. And this visual just says it all, doesn't it? On the left, you've got this tangled web of calculations, these epicycles, this patch on top of a patch, just to make the Earth-centered model work. But on the right, Copernicus's model. By putting the sun in the middle, all that complexity just vanished. The math became clean, simple, and for a mind like his, just beautiful. And this is so important to remember. Copernicus wasn't a revolutionary trying to kick humanity off its pedestal at the center of creation. He was a mathematician. He found a more elegant solution to an ancient puzzle. He was driven by this deep desire for mathematical harmony. And this wasn't some sudden aha moment. We're talking about almost 40 years of his life spent on meticulous work, developing his theory and getting the math just right. The man was cautious, he was thorough, and he was in absolutely no hurry to publish his findings.
Which is why the Copernican revolution, well, it wasn't a revolution in the way we think of one. It didn't happen overnight. It was more like a slow, gradual sunrise that took about 150 years to fully light up the world.
This timeline really paints the picture of just how slow this change was. So Copernicus's book finally gets published in 1543, right as he's dying, and for decades, nobody really cared. It was mostly ignored or just seen as a clever mathematical trick. It took until around 1610, when Galileo pointed his new telescope at the sky and saw things like moons orbiting Jupiter. That's when the idea started to get some real traction. That's when the church, right in the middle of the very tense Counter-Reformation, officially banned the book in 1616. And you could argue the revolution wasn't truly finished until 1687, when Isaac Newton came along and finally gave us the why. His law of universal gravitation explained the physics that held the whole sun-centered system together.
You see, the revolution wasn't one big explosion. It was this slow, profound shift in thinking. The idea was revolutionary not because everyone instantly adopted it, but because of the deep chain reaction of changes it set off in science, in philosophy, in our entire understanding of our place in the universe. So, what's the real takeaway from all this? What's the true legacy of Copernicus? It's that he was a problem solver, not a martyr. He kicked off a revolution of perspective, not rebellion. He taught us a huge lesson, that our gut feelings, our common sense, what our eyes seem to tell us, can be dead wrong. He showed that math could reveal a deeper truth, and by moving the Earth, he started this much bigger process of decentering humanity, and laid the groundwork for all of modern physics, for Galileo, for Kepler, and for Newton.
And that's what makes this whole story so powerful, right? It's a huge reminder that what seems completely obvious isn't always true. So it makes you wonder, what obvious truth or common sense idea that we all believe today will people in the future look back on and think, how could they have ever believed that?